This is Here, the Happiest People on Earth, Chapter 11, titled The Golden Chain. It was May 24th, 1975. Once again, Rose and I were boarding a plane at Los Angeles International Airport. No crowd this time to see us off, only Steve and his wife, Deborah, who had driven us out. No worried group of elders from the Armenian church, no anxious faces. Why should there be? In the 24 years that had passed since our first airplane trip, Rose and I had flown well over 2 million miles. Steve and I exchanged a few words about the television program he'd been filming for the fellowship in Portland, Oregon, while we were away. Rose gave Debbie a final hug. Then Rose and I walked through the boarding tube into the aircraft. We were flying that evening to Honolulu en route to Auckland, where our 16 New Zealand chapters were sponsoring a week-long event called Jesus 75. At last report, so many thousands were coming that the fellowship had to rent a racetrack called Alexandra Park for the 7 nights. Dinner was served after takeoff, then Rose leaned her head against the window for her usual airplane siesta. It was a good opportunity for me to prepare the answer to the first question these thousands would ask. What is the fellowship? How should I answer a question like that? In terms of statistics? Well, these were interesting, certainly. I got out a pad and pencil and jotted down years in existence, 24. Number of states having chapters, 50. Number of countries having chapters, 52. Total numbers of chapters, 1,650. Average monthly attendance at all chapters, over 500,000. Rate of growth, 1 new chapter every day. I smiled, remembering Oral Roberts' dream of 1,000 chapters that had once seemed so impossible. Soon we'd have double that number. I went on writing. Monthly circulation of Voice magazine, 800,000. TV stations carrying our Good News program, 150. Weekly viewing audience, 4 million. Airlifts, 3 a year since 1965. I put my pencil down on the tray. Was this really the way to describe the fellowship? Counting heads, listing events? That wasn't it. Well then, what about our various ministries? Healing, for one. We never put much emphasis on healing at the fellowship because right away it tended to get all the attention. But healings take place just the same, all the time. Sometimes we'll invite a man with the Holy Spirit's gift of healing to conduct a special service. More often, it will simply be an ordinary member going about his ordinary business, used by God at a particular moment. My gift, for example, wasn't helping, not healing, and yet. In May 1961, the fellowship had sent a large delegation to the World Pentecostal Conference, meeting that year in Jerusalem. What a thrill it was to stroll through places we'd known all our lives, from the Bible, the Mount of Olives, the beautiful gate, the pool of Siloam. We were almost sorry when it came to time to go to the auditorium. 3,000 people were attending the conference, and it seemed to Rose and me that they'd all arrived in the vestibule at once, and were trying to squeeze at the same moment into the lecture hall. The conference was so popular that delegates had to wear a badge in order to be admitted. We spotted our friend Jim Brown, the fellowship's delegate from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and together we stood back, waiting for the crowd to thin out. Dimo Shakarian? The voice was a woman's, the accent Russian or Polish. I searched the room for who could be calling me. There she is, Jim pointed. They were making their way through the crowd toward us, a man and a woman. She was short and heavy-set, maybe in her late 50s. The man was the most badly crippled human being I had ever seen. He was bent into the shape of a 7. He walked, clutching a cane with both hands, his torso parallel to the floor. You were looking for me? I asked the woman. I couldn't even see the man's face. Yes, Mr. Shakarian. This man, he needs help. She explained that she had found him living in a lean-to outside the city. He had asked her to help him get to the auditorium because he had heard that Jesus was healing people there. When they learned that every seat was taken, someone suggested that they talk to me. My heart went out to the ragged little man. Both of them, the woman told us, were Jewish. I had only to think of the Jews in the fellowship, men like David Rothschild, president of our Beverly Hills chapter, to know that God has a special love for his covenant people. But what could I do here? I had no special pull at the conference. And then an idea occurred to me. Suppose I were to give this man my own credentials for the afternoon. Jim Brown was one of the speakers today, but here, I said, unpinning my badge, you wear this, it will get you in. I knelt on the floor of the vestibule and bent back, trying to reach the little man's coat lapel. At last I got the badge pinned, and I was about to stand up when I heard an unmistakable voice. No, Deimos, do not leave this man. You are to pray for his healing, right here. I was taken aback. Here? Now? With the vestibule full of high-powered Pentecostal leaders from all over the world? I glanced up at Jim Brown. Jim had a lot more experience with healing than I, and you, Deimos, right here. So, still on my knees, I spoke in the man's ear. Sir, would you let me pray for you right now? For an answer, the little man rested his head on the top of his cane and closed his eyes. Dear Jesus, I said, we thank you that you made the lame leap for joy here on these very hills. Today, Lord, another lame man is coming to you, one of your chosen ones. Tears trickled over the gnarled knuckles and dropped onto the floor. A group was beginning to form around us. In the name of Jesus Christ, I told him, stand straight. I heard something snap. At first, I was afraid the fragile little man had broken something, but the groan that came from him as he raised head and back a few inches was of release and not pain. With such an effort that his throat muscles bulged, he straightened another inch. There was the crack again. Again he struggled as if wrestling with invisible chains. Taller still. If anyone in the vestibule had been unaware of what was taking place, the women's shrieks turned every head toward us. A miracle, she kept crying. It is a miracle. The little man straightened the final inch and gazed triumphantly into my face. From all around us came a chorus of praise and thanksgiving in a dozen languages. I, too, stood up. I reached out and took the man's walking stick. In his strength only, I said, and sure enough, shuffling a little at first, then bolder and firmer, he began to walk back and forth, spine straight, shoulders erect. Instead of the talk he had planned that afternoon, Jim Brown told the story of what had happened in the vestibule. No problem for the couple now getting in. Seats were found for them, and us too, in the front row of the balcony. Every now and then, as Jim spoke, the little man would leap from his chair. I'm the one, he would cry. I'm the one. And he would skip and dance and cavort up and down the aisle. Until I was afraid he would go home crippled again by his own exertion. Yes, I could tell that story in Alexandra Park, though I could not explain it now any more than I could at the time. Unlike men with the specific gift of healing, I had not sought this experience. I had not spent hours and days fasting and preparing myself, nor did this strange power stay with me more than momentarily, though needy people came hurrying to me for the remainder of the conference. The best I'd be able to tell the people in Auckland is that healing is one of the normal functions of the body of Christ, and that any member of the body may be called upon at certain times to perform it. When that call comes, the key seems to be obedience. I glanced guiltily at Rose, snuggled beneath the airline blanket, remembering a certain night in Downey. We'd gotten into bed. It was midnight, time to be turning out the lights, but for some reason Rose was restless. She kept getting up, walking to the window, coming back to sit on the side of the bed. I was mystified. Usually I'm the night owl. Rose, the one who can't get to sleep fast enough. What's the matter, honey? I'm going to telephone Vivian Fuller. Vivian Fuller? The Fullers lived in southern New Jersey. Herb Fuller was president of our Philadelphia chapter, and I seemed to recall the last time we were there that his wife had been having eye trouble. But at this hour of the night? Rose, do you know what time it is in New Jersey? 3 o'clock in the morning. Rose sighed. I know, she said, and yes, she agreed. It would be better to wait till morning. But I have never seen the Spirit of God make a person so unsettled. Rose could not relax. It was up to brush her hair again, back to bed, up to see that the stove was turned off, back once more, up to be sure the doors were locked. For goodness sake, honey, I said at last, make the call before you wear a hole in the carpet. Rose fairly jumped for the phone. I was surprised at how quickly the party at the other end answered. Rose listened for a while, then turned to me. Deimos, get on the other phone. I went into the front room and picked up the extension. Vivian, Rose said, repeat for Deimos what you've just told me. Not sounding the least bit sleepy or annoyed, Vivian Folder told me that her eye condition had been diagnosed as advanced glaucoma and that it was not responding to medical treatment. Knowing she was going blind, she had tried to face it courageously, spending hours training herself to walk through the house without bumping into furniture. But gradually fear and discouragement had gotten the best of her. This particular night, the depression had been unbearable. She had lain awake, feeling abandoned by God, abandoned by everyone. Please, God, she had prayed at last. If you love me, show me by having someone telephone me right now in the middle of the night. For a while, there was only the hum of the long-distance wires. Vivian, said Rose, God not only told me to call you, he told me something else. He told me you're going to be healed completely. I hope my gulp didn't carry all the way to New Jersey, but Rose talked on, reminding Vivian of all the wonderful sign of God's power we'd seen together in the fellowship through the years. Afterwards, the three of us prayed for Vivian's total healing. Beginning at that moment, when we finished, it was 1:30 a.m. in Downey, 4:30 in New Jersey. Several days later, Vivian called back. I don't have anything really concrete to report, she said. But an hour after we talked the other night, something seemed to go pop inside my head. I don't know any other way to put it. The next day I went to the specialist. All he could say that there hadn't been any deterioration since the last visit. A few weeks later, there was a second call from Vivian. Not only had the deterioration stopped, but the eyes seemed to be getting better. Months went by, and then we were all at the Statler Hilton in New York City for a regional convention. I shared with the crowded ballroom Vivian's story. Some of the finest doctors in the East had diagnosed her condition as irreversible glaucoma. But now, Vivian walked up the steps to the microphone. She described the agonizing progress of the disease, how each day she would say to herself that perhaps this was the last time she would see Herb's face. Then she spoke about the lowest point of her depression when she lay in her bed at 3 a.m. praying that someone would telephone. She told the story of Rose's call, of the subsequent visits to the specialist, and of his delighted announcement that her eyes had inexplicably begun to respond to the identical treatment he had been using all along. I praise God every day for my wonderful eyesight. And Rose's obedience continued to be used. Even as Vivian was speaking, people began leaving their seats and coming forward to the platform, until 26 sufferers from glaucoma were standing on the stage. In an atmosphere charged with faith, the entire ballroom prayed for them. 6 months later, 7 of those 26 attended the convention in Washington, D.C. We still don't know about the other 19, but every one of those 7 had been completely healed. At every convention, similar experiences are recounted, and more amazing ones than those. Terminal cancer cured on the spot. A cardiac patient given a new heart. Not a healed one, a new one, with no trace of the plastic tubes and valves inserted earlier by surgery. A young man dead of a bullet wound from a .38 pistol, sitting up in a Jacksonville hospital and calling for water after a fellowship director prayed for him. Another man certified as dead by a doctor in South Africa, raised to life when a group from the fellowship prayed, today triumphantly carrying his death certificate in his breast pocket. And in every case, it happened when someone was willing to be obedient, no matter how hopeless or ridiculous it appeared at the time. Or our ministry of outreach all over the world. The figure that God had given a group of us in prayer last December, 1,250,000,000 people to be reached in 1975, seems so astronomical as to be unreal. But when the whole electronic age still seemed unreal to me, and it was electronics which, already now in August, was reaching this unheard of multitude. But now the Fellowship's radio program was going out weekly in 21 languages throughout Europe, South America, and Asia. At home, our weekly half-hour TV series, Good News, was entering its 4th year nationwide, with new outlets this year in Canada, Bermuda, Australia, and Japan. And an important part of this picture was our son Steve, now our executive producer. Microphones, dials, tape footages seemed to come to him as naturally as they eluded me. I shuddered, remembering my first day before the cameras. The idea of the Good News show was that I'd get other men talking about their experiences just as I did at fellowship meetings. It sounded simple enough. And since studio time is so expensive, we hoped to film the first 13.5-hour programs in 1 week. But when I stepped onto the sound stage, saw the cables, the cameras, the men holding stopwatches, I balked like a cow in front of a strange stall. The script directions baffled me. Stand here, sit there, turn your head now. When the hot lights went on at 7 a.m., I began to sweat. By noon, I looked as though we'd been filming in a bathtub. Worst of all was the teleprompter with my lines showing up in a little box attached to the camera. I got words twisted. I turned sentences around until the poor fellows I was interviewing were as flummoxed as I was. At the end of 2 weeks filming, I'd lost 20 pounds in my enthusiasm for the entire project. In desperation, I went to the producer of that original series, Dick Mann. Let's not use a script, I pleaded. Just let me talk to people. You couldn't do that on TV, Dick explained patiently. Time had to be calculated to the second. The camera crew had to know when certain shots were coming, and of course, his expertise prevailed until the prints came back. They showed a mechanical man with glazed eyes and a wooden face. The next series we did amateur style. No script, no rehearsal. Just prayer beforehand, prayer while we filmed, prayer while we finished. I forgot the mechanics of production and concentrated on the man I was with. All of us felt the change at once. The flow of God's Spirit into that studio. Cameras stopped jamming. People arrived on time. The 4 interviews in each half-hour segment formed a perfect balance. Dick Mann couldn't get over it. Every time he gave the 1 minute to go sign, he told me I would finish precisely 60 seconds later. Even hard to explain things happened. One time we were filming in Puerto Rico, 18 stories selected by the chapter there. It was a tight schedule because we had to do all our shooting by daylight, and it kept raining. On the afternoon I was to interview a man who had been healed of leprosy. There was a regular deluge. The camera crew covered their equipment with tarpaulins, and we sat around watching the rain stream down. Rogelio Perea arrived, and I shook the stump of a hand he held out to me. At first I thought it was the joy in his eyes that made the dame seem brighter. Then I realized a shaft of sunlight had broken through the clouds. The crew snatched off the rain covers, and Rogelio and the lady who had come to interpret for him stepped in front of the cameras. Through Sally Olson, he described what it had been like to learn at age 9 that he had leprosy. The physical agony of the disease was easier to bear than being taken from his family and shut away in an isolation camp. Up till then, he had never even seen a leper. Suddenly, he was living among people whose very appearance terrified him, and worse was to come. Within a few years, he was the most disfigured of them all, so covered with hideous sores that even the other lepers would not come near him, but made him eat his meals alone. And then one day, when he was 22, a group of Christians visited the leper colony, and for the first time he heard the message of Jesus. It transformed Rogelio from a miserable and hopeless individual into one filled with joy and love. But now the disease had eaten away his vocal cords. He began to ask God to give him back his voice so that he could tell others about the new life he had found. Some time later, he heard about a healing service to be held in the Pentecostal church of nearby Rio Piedras. An indescribable hope began to build in him. He badgered authorities into giving him a rare pass to leave the camp, and he attended the service, sitting in the rear well away from the other worshippers. When the healing line formed, he again hung back, waiting until all the others were finished, and as he did, despair overwhelmed him. The healing was done, he saw, by the laying on of hands. No man would be willing to touch a leper. At last the altar rail was empty. Rogelio hurried forward and knelt down. Pastor Torres stepped up to him and placed both hands on his head. Then he put them on his face, his shoulders, his back. He put both arms around him and embraced him. And in that moment, Rogelio knew that he was healed. It was many weeks later before the doctors could believe what their own tests showed. Rogelio Perea was no longer an active case. At last he was released, and for the last 25 years had preached all over Puerto Rico. God had given him not only a beautiful speaking voice, but a singing voice too. The musicians who had come with him stepped forward, and with a lilting calypso rhythm, Rogelio sang to the glory of God. The last note died away, and the sun disappeared. Cameramen and musicians had barely time to get their equipment and recover before the downpour resumed in earnest. We shared the experience at a meeting of the San Juan chapter that evening. Wasn't that lull in the storm timed just perfectly for the filming? Uncomprehended faces gazed back. Nowhere else in all San Juan, it seemed, had the rain let up, even for a minute. This is the way we'd done the TV program for 3 years now. No scripts, no rehearsals, relying only on the spirit. The shows were not slick, but they had a quality of truth that touched people. Each station gave a local phone number after the program so that people who wanted to take some new step as a result could get in touch with someone from a nearby chapter. I had the figures somewhere on the number of calls we were getting nationwide. I fumbled beneath the seat in front of me for my briefcase. Rose was awake now, looking curiously at the columns and numbers I had jotted down. "What's TV 13/3? She asked. 13 shows in 3 days, I said. That's the standard time we allow for filming now, right? And we never have to retake any of it. I dug out the reports. I'm trying to find out, I said, how many people are phoning in after each program. I think, Deimos, said Rose after a while, that how many people isn't as interesting as what happens. One single man and how it changes him. One single man, but which of the thousands of stories to tell? I let my mind roam across the country from Puerto Rico westward, the East Coast, the Middle West, across the mountains, all the way to California and beyond, to the opposite end of the nations in Hawaii, and I thought of Harold Shiraki. Harold was the very first person to call our TV number in Honolulu after the programs began to be shown there in September 1972. He had not intended to tune in that Sunday morning. What Harold intended to do was something very different. Harold had been born on a small coffee farm in Kona on the island of Hawaii, the sixth of 16 children. In the best Japanese tradition, he was taught to work hard, to consider others, to respect authority. Harold's father had Parkinson's disease. When he became too ill to work, the older children left school to support the family. Because they worked extra hours each day in the blazing sun, Harold was able to continue his education, becoming the first in the family to graduate from high school. From then on, Harold worked to see that the younger children had the same opportunity. He got up each morning at 4 o'clock, dressed by kerosene lantern, walked many miles to whatever coffee farm was hiring. Only when all of his younger brothers and sisters finished high school did he allow himself to marry and start a family of his own. By now, Harold had moved to Honolulu, working first as a stevedore on the docks, then as a clerk in a grocery store, at last going into business himself. Harold's habits of hard work paid off. By the 1970s, he had managed to set aside a considerable sum of money. And then most of it was taken away from him. It was done smoothly, smilingly, by men he trusted. When he realized what had happened, the faith he had built his life on collapsed. It had been faith in human effort and decency, not in God. Nominally, Harold's family were Buddhists, but like many of the island people, they actually believed in a variety of gods and spirits. One, Odaisen, was particularly influential with them. There was a small stone image of him in the Japanese temple in Kono, which the family would consult on all decisions. When the god was in favor, his image was easy to lift. When it could scarcely be budged, the answer was no. Over the years, Harold had become disillusioned with these traditional beliefs as he saw the bondage in which they held his family. His elderly mother, now a widow, spent her life in terror of offending one spirit or another. When he moved to Honolulu, Harold had joined the Episcopal Church because it seemed to offer freedom from such fears. He had tried to talk his mother into becoming a Christian too, but she explained that, although Jesus was one of the gods she prayed to, his primary interest was in white people. Every picture of him, she pointed out, showed him with a beard, proof that he could not have much concern for Orientals. Now, with the loss of his money, Harold turned to his minister. The clergyman listened sympathetically, agreed that injustice had been done, but counseled against going to court. These things happen all the time in business, and there's not a thing you and I can do about it. I tried to forget it. But that was the one thing Harold found he could not do. He stopped eating, stopped seeing his friends, sat alone in his living room with the shades pulled down, feeling the hatred grow inside him. Honesty sacrificed long hours. If all this got you nowhere, what was the point to life? Death was better. Dead people could sleep. Dead people weren't cheated and robbed. Harold knew a friend who had a gun, but he was not going to die alone. Before he shot himself, he was going to shoot two other men, 3, if he could get to them all before he was stopped. The idea grew until it became an obsession, until it became the only idea in his head. A Sunday, It would have to be a Sunday because he would tell the friend that he wanted to go hunting a Sunday in September as soon as the hunting season opened. The Sunday Harold had chosen arrived. His wife again begged him to go to church. He had not been to a service since his talk with the minister. Harold only shook his head. At least turn on the television, she begged him. Watch a ball game. His strange indifference to everything alarmed her. Harold shook his head again, then glanced warily at his wife. She must never suspect what he was intending to do. Sure, switch on the set. Look at a ball game until she stopped worrying and went to church. He glanced at his watch. 10:35. The afternoon games would have started back on the mainland. He switched on Channel 4. Two men were talking together. One was white, the other, he wasn't sure. Polynesian, probably? I chuckled at the recollection. How many times I've praised God for this curious quality of the Armenian face. Jews think I'm Jewish, Arabs take me for an Arab. In South America, I'm addressed in Spanish. In the East, I'm assumed to be Indian. And now in Honolulu, I was being taken for Hawaiian. In his distracted state of mind, Harold could not follow what the two men were saying. Still leaning forward in his chair as he'd been to turn on the scent, he simply stared at their faces. They were the happiest-looking people he'd ever seen. He tried to concentrate on the words, but his thoughts were in too great a turmoil, so he continued to stare, and as he did, a strange peace settled over the closed and shaded room. Love, harmony, hope. Almost as though these things were flowing out of the television set itself. At the end of the program, a telephone number was shown on the screen. Still sitting on the front of his chair cushion where he'd been from the moment the picture of his screen came into focus, Harold repeated the number to himself. A few minutes later, he was talking to Roy Hitchcock of our Honolulu chapter, hearing words too wonderful to believe. Jesus knows all about your situation. Jesus is the answer. Jesus loves you. Today, Harold is a leader not only in his own Episcopal church, but in fellowship programs all over the islands. He never got back his money, but he was helped at the fellowship to lay down his burden of resentment and rage and come away a victorious person. He has not only made a fresh start himself, he's helped hundreds more to find their own new beginnings. Among the very first was his 81-year-old mother. Seeing the change in her son, she realized that here was a power greater than that of the spirit she'd been appeasing so long. She and other members of the family made a heap of the various images and shrines they had kept in their homes and burned them in the yard of a church. Harold's mother died in 1973, a serene and radiant Christian. It was experiences like these that assured us that television had a role in the vision I had seen of all the world awakening to life. So did the modern marvel of jet travel. I started listing the countries where our airlifts of good news had taken us. England, Sweden, Norway, France, Italy, Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam, India, over 50 of them. In most, after the weeks of meetings and rallies, something more important was left behind, a local chapter, often several of them, as a continuing center of layman's activity. In other countries, such as Finland, Estonia, Yugoslavia, we could only wonder and pray about the long-term effects. I thought of my first visit to a communist country and the resolve that had been born in me then. It was in Cuba after Castro had come to power, and our little group was staying at the former Havana Hilton, now renamed the Cuban Libra. Castro had made the hotel his headquarters, and the place bristled with armed soldiers, but we never caught a glimpse of the leader himself. Then one morning around 2 a.m., as I was climbing into bed, I suddenly knew that if I were to get dressed and take the elevator down to the restaurant, I would come face to face with Fidel Castro. I'd had too much experience with the spirit by now to question such inexplicable bits of knowledge, so as quietly as I could, I got back into my clothes. Rose opened her eyes. "Where are you going?" "Downstairs to meet Castro." Rose, too, was used to this kind of nudging from the spirit. "That's nice," she said sleepily. Down in the restaurant, the only customers were a group of very young soldiers, 15 and 16 years old, I guess, sitting at the counter drinking orange juice. A few years earlier, the waiter told me, the place would have been jammed at this hour. North Americans, he said wistfully, from the casino. He gestured upward toward the now deserted gambling rooms on the mezzanine. They didn't care what they spent. He wrote down my order for one dish of ice cream and went off to the kitchen with a sigh. When he came back with it, he lingered by the table, seeming glad of the chance to talk. Cuban Spanish was different from the Mexican variety I'd been raised on, but we had no trouble understanding each other. When Premier Castro comes in tonight, I said, will you tell him I'm a dairy farmer from California and I'd like to talk to him? Tonight, the waiter echoed. He won't be here tonight. He never comes in this late. I finished the ice cream. Tonight he will. The waiter stared at me. Someone told you he is coming here? I thought about that a minute. Yes, I agreed. Someone told me. The man shook his head. Impossible, he said. He never comes in after 10 o'clock. And sure enough, it began to seem that the waiter was right. Another 5 minutes passed. 10. The young soldiers left. I picked up my check and went to the cash register. The cashier was counting out my change when there was a clomping of booted feet in the corridor. Through the door came 18 or 20 black-bearded men in olive green uniforms, some carrying rifles, others American-made machine guns. In the center of the group was Fidel Castro. Castro sat at a table and ordered steak while the bodyguards stationed themselves around the room and, having no one else to look at, looked at me. I saw the waiter bend down and speak to Castro. He too looked at me for a moment. Then with a finger he motioned me to join him. I sat down at his right, conscious of gun muzzles following me across the room. Castro asked a number of questions about dairying in California and seemed disappointed when I would not let him buy me a steak. When I come to visit you, he said, I will drink a gallon of milk. All over the room, the bearded men burst out laughing. To my relief, the guns were lowered, and several of them lit up cigarettes. I had known the revolutionary leader only through his nonstop radio speeches. I was surprised to find him in person, an attentive and careful listener. And what brings you to Cuba? He asked after a while. I told him that a group of us had come here to get to know Cubans in our own fields of work and tell them what the Holy Spirit was doing among people like themselves in other countries. Again, to my surprise, he seemed genuinely interested. He told me he'd once been in the hospital in Brownsville, Texas. Every week there were two men on television. One was Billy Graham and the other was Oral Roberts. I thought these were honest men, and what they said were honest things. We had talked for 35 minutes when a very angry, very drunk North American appeared at the table. Don't you people ever answer letters? He demanded. I've been waiting 3 months to hear from this so-called government. I couldn't follow much of what he said, but I gather he was owner of a nightclub which had been closed by the revolutionary government. I was amazed at the man's daring in that room full of soldiers, but he was apparently too wrapped up in his own troubles to notice them. Your people are losing money too, he said. Don't forget that. I was bringing good business down here. Castro's face had turned almost as gray-green as his uniform. Good business, he said. Is that what you call it? Gambling and prostitutes? Was that all you people cared about in this country? I tried to catch the club owner's eye. Surely no one could be so drunk or so self-absorbed that he could miss the cry in that question. Did you ever care? Did you ever know us? But the guy was past hearing. Don't give me the big moral line, he said. Cubans were making plenty off it. Why, every time Castro stood up, his dinner unfinished. He was halfway to the door, the soldiers following him. When he turned around, came back, and held out his hand. I'm glad you came, he said. I wish... The grayness was still in his face, and he did not complete the sentence. In a moment, they had all gone, the nightclub owner following after them, still complaining, and I was alone at the table. I looked at my watch. 3:05. I wish more men from your country had come to Cuba to pray instead of to gamble. What if they had? I wondered, as the elevator carried me back upstairs. What would the world be like today if the millions of traveling Americans had gone with God's love for the people they visited? What if they went now? From that night on, this became my plea. Everyone I met with, the fellowship. Everywhere I met with the fellowship. Go, tell the good news, travel for God, help to offset another kind of traveler the world sees too often. And our men have gone as people who have received from the faithfulness of other places and other centuries and have come back to repay a little of our debt. I thought of a September evening in Moscow in 1966, 7 years after the visit to Cuba, when I was able to tell 2,200 people gathered in the Baptist church the story of the Russian Pentecostals crossing the mountains to Armenia in their covered wagons. 2,200 people rising from their seats, lifting their arms to heaven, weeping for joy as the Spirit swept that meeting. The following day, I had the chance to record the same story for Moscow radio, to thank the Russian people from the bottom of my heart for bringing us the unspeakable gift of God. I lowered my seat back a few inches and closed my eyes. Men all over the earth, waking from death to life. Yes, that was the fellowship. And I had seen it in our living room in Downey. What else had the vision showed? Men coming alive, not only to God, but to one another. Men who had been isolated, coming together, discovering one another. That, too, was the fellowship. At the opening session of conventions now, we like to ask for a show of hands. How many Episcopalians here tonight? How many Presbyterians? How many Baptists? The best part to me was not that we got a response to every question, but that each time hands were raised all over the room. Catholics sitting with Methodists, Quakers with Seventh-day Adventists, so that when the Spirit descended on the meeting, the two men embracing each other in the 17th row might belong to churches which hadn't spoken for centuries. Races came together. Things are changing now, but back in the 50s, segregation was still an issue in many parts of the country. I remember preparing for a World Convention in Atlanta. We had the ballroom rented at a downtown hotel, over 1,000 rooms reserved for 5 nights. Radio time lined up, registration forms printed, all the interlocking details involved in bringing a large group together. And then, a month or so before the convention, the hotel discovered that we were expecting, as always, a number of black businessmen. Well, they were going to arrange so-called identical accommodations nearby. The meetings would be followed on closed-circuit TV in a luxurious lounge. It took about 1 million phone calls to move that convention out to Denver, and there we noticed a curious thing. The black turnout was not only big, it was a lot bigger than we expected. Finally, an Atlanta clothing store owner shed some light on it. My friends have been asking me for months why I go to the white man's prayer breakfast, but when they heard what happened about the hotel, well, I had to rent a bus to bring along all the people who wanted to come out here with me. In the summer of 1973, incidentally, we held a regional convention in Atlanta's Hyatt House. 1,500 people each night, black and white, indistinguishably together. Generations coming together under the leadership of Richard and his beautiful wife, Evangeline. There was now a full youth program at every convention. Many times in a hotel corridor, I'd pass a long-haired kid and a middle-aged man in a business suit, weeping tears of reconciliation on each other's shoulders. People of all backgrounds coming together, blacks and whites meeting together in many of our 100 South African chapters, Protestants and Catholics asking one another's pardon, embracing with joy in our chapters in Belfast, Ireland. People tearing down every wall that stands between us and others. I recalled one woman who literally had to have a wall between herself and the rest of the world before she could feel comfortable. Sarah Elias was a musician who'd studied piano at Juilliard in New York and sung under Leopold Stokowski. A tall, imposing woman, Sarah didn't look like she had a problem in the world. So when she stipulated single room for a regional convention in Indianapolis, nobody dreamed that a tormenting lifelong fear of rejection lay behind the request. As it turned out, every bed in the Indianapolis hotel was needed to accommodate the crowd that wanted to attend that May weekend in 1972. I'm sorry, the registrar in the lobby told her. We've had to put you in a double. He checked his list. The other lady is Sister Frances Clare of the School Sisters of Notre Dame. I'm sure you'll enjoy being with her. Sarah Elias was sure she wouldn't. Brought up by holiness people in a small town in western Pennsylvania, she'd been taught to distrust nuns in general. But the real problem was a tragic childhood. From the time her father shot and killed her mother when she was a tiny girl, through the years in an orphanage, to the day she was disinherited by the family which had adopted her, she had learned that people will reject you. And so she in turn rejected people, shutting them out of her life. Whenever she wasn't working, literally keeping a wall between herself and the world. No one, as I say, knew these things about her until, rushing up to the room when she believed it would be empty, she found the other woman there, and Sister Frances Clare, a wise and gentle Christian with a specific ministry in the healing of memories, asked if she might pray for Sarah. Out it all came. In the hours that followed, the fear, the resentment, the bitterness, in flowed the love and acceptance of God. When I saw Sarah that evening, her face was so transfigured that I asked her to come to the microphone and tell us all what had happened. Afterwards, she sat down at the piano. When she finished, that entire convention got to its feet and applauded until she played again. There were 4 standing ovations, and at the end, all of us knew that the Spirit himself had played for us that evening. Sarah Elias was one of the whole category of people now served by the fellowship, business and professional women. In the beginning, I'd been so concerned for the men who were missing out on life that I hadn't been aware of anyone else. The women in the early years of fellowship, and there were many, were generally the wives of such men, Christians themselves, looking for a way to reach their husbands. Then, as the fellowship got better known, a new group of women appeared, married and unmarried, young and old. They were working people who, like men, out of felt left out of traditional church programs, sewing circles, rummage sales, morning coffees. They were as out of the question for these doctors, teachers, office workers as they were for me. We had women lawyers attending now, actresses, factory workers, sales ladies, I wrote on my paper, nurses, newspaper women. Demos? Rose was nudging me, and I looked up to see the stewardess standing over us with a tray of sandwiches. We'd be in Honolulu in a little over an hour. Stewardesses, I added to the notes in front of me. There's been 5 or 6 at the last convention. I reread the handwritten pages. Outreach all over the world in all kinds of ways to all kinds of peoples. To all kinds of people. Did that portray the fellowship? What was it Rose had said? Tell about one individual and how he changed. It was true. All the statistics in the world couldn't convey the wonder of a single life reborn of the Spirit. But where could I start or stop? The minute I told the fabulous story of George Otis or Walter Black or General Ralph Haynes, I'd run out of time and have to leave out the equally fabulous story of Jim Watt or Otto Kundert or Don Locke. There were a million stories now in the fellowship, each one as wonderful as the next, each one unique, yet each linked to all the others in a golden chain, each one linked. Why not tell the story of one such link, one sequence in the endless chain reaction that is the Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship? It was a Friday morning in the early 60s when I received a telephone call from a young man who told me that we had met recently at a fellowship convention in Oklahoma. Mr. Shakarian, the young man said, I wish you could talk to my uncle. I think he's ready to know the Lord. Who is your uncle? Shannon Vandroof. The name sounded vaguely familiar. Where does he live? He gave me an address in a very swank area of Downey. What does he do? I asked a little nervously. He's a builder. Have you ever heard of Cinderella Homes? That's his company. Well, my first thought was that I could never talk to him. Everybody out our way knew Cinderella Homes. It was a big, big business. But at least I promised to give Shannon Vandroof a call. And the next day, Saturday, I did. Far from being a high-pressure type, Shannon proved easy and comfortable to talk with. And his nephew was right. Shannon was ready to hear the good news of Jesus. He and his wife, Vida, invited Rose and me that very evening to their large home by the golf course. Later went with us to a fellowship convention in Phoenix, Arizona, where both received the baptism in the Holy Spirit. Now a new name entered the chain reaction. Dr. Ray Charles Jarman was the pastor of the big church in Southgate, California, which the Vandroofs had attended for 14 years. Under Dr. Jarman's brilliant preaching, it had grown into $1 million institution with upholstered seats, thick carpets, air conditioning, imported marble statuary. Dr. Jarman also had a daily radio program and was a force in the intellectual life of Southern California. The only thing the Vandroofs had never heard him preach was Christ. Like many a well-educated minister, he had long ago ceased to believe in the divinity of Jesus, miracles, and other pre-scientific concepts. But he was a conscientious pastor who sincerely wanted to give his congregation something real. And for 50 years he sought this elusive reality. He went into religious science, New Thought, Christian unity, Christian science. Finding his own life increasingly empty, he turned to Eastern religions, studying for 3 years under Paramahansa Yogananda, among others. He went on to Rosicrucianism, and after that to Theosophy. In 1961, before the drug was declared illegal, he entered a clinic in San Francisco where he paid a nurse, a doctor, and a psychiatrist to stay with him during a 24-hour experiment with LSD. Far from providing a revelation of God, it gave him nightmares which reoccurred for months. Meanwhile, after his own conversion, Shannon Vandroof had gone on a quiet campaign to get Jarman to a fellowship meeting. The erudite minister was emphatically not interested. For nearly 4 years, Shannon kept at him. Jarman got to the place where he hated to see the man coming. At last, a mutual friend invited Jarman to an evening of Christian music and fellowship at the Vandross. With a shrug, Dr. Jarman agreed. What did he have to lose? It would be another experiment, which is how it was that in August 1965, Ray Charles Jarman drove out to Shannon's with 3 people from his church. The Vandross' enormous living room was so crowded it was difficult to find a place to sit. Jarman noticed a radiance in these people which puzzled him. They were so animated as people. They were as animated as people at a cocktail party. It puzzled him and annoyed him. If he hadn't brought people with him, he would have left right then. As the evening went on, Jarman grew more and more uncomfortable. There was singing, prayer, testimony, followed by exclamations of "Praise the Lord." Jarman kept thinking of what his university friends would say. Then about halfway through the evening, the front door opened, and there, supported by 2 men on either side of her, stood the most emaciated woman he had ever seen. Deep circles outlined her eyes. Her clothes hung as though there were no body at all beneath them. The woman was my sister Florence. As Jarman watched in horror, the men half carried her across the room and lowered her into a chair. It was 25 years since Florence's automobile accident. What a quarter century of service it had been. Often with Rose at the piano or organ, Florence had sung in churches and fellowship meetings the length and breadth of the country. Now, precisely when the dream had foretold, she was dying of a rare form of cancer. "Florence Shakarian Lalalian," Shannon said, "do you have strength enough to sing for us?" Florence smiled. "I'll try," she said. She put both hands on her own forehead and pushed it back, not having the strength to raise her head. Then she began to sing, and Ray Jarman found himself face to face with the reality that he had sought so long. Jarman was an opera buff. He had heard most of the great voices of our day, but I had never heard a voice like this, he told me later. When she sang, it was as though an angel stood in the room. Florence asked them all to join in the chorus to "How Great Thou Art." As they did, her voice soared above the others, higher and higher like a meadowlark, until Jarman felt he was standing at the gate of heaven. It was Florence's last song, and for Ray Charles Jarman, the first time in his life that he had wept in public. But so ingrained was his habit of intellectualizing everything that his mind continued to resist what his spirit now knew. It was not until some months later that he took the terrifying step of jumping beyond where his understanding could take him. In his widower's apartment, with Shannon Vandross as his witness, he got down on his knees, another thing he had never done before, and asked Jesus to take over his life. He stood up as fulfilled and joyous as he had once been empty and afraid. It is this new Ray Jarman that hundreds of thousands of men have heard in fellowship meetings around the world. I preached for 52 years, he'll tell us, before I knew Jesus. But who knows in the last 9 years how many men Jarman has reached, and how many of those in turn have reached others? Where does the golden chain end, which links each of us to each other one? Where does it begin? I thought of the links forged before I was born. Magardich Mushigan prophesying back in Karakala. "A year from today you will have a son." Thought of that son driving a wagon load of vegetables behind a horse named Jack. What a strong link it was that joined the lives of the Shakarians and the Mushigans. It was Magardich's grandson, Harry, who one Sunday in 1955 received a vision in the Armenian Pentecostal Church on Goodrich Boulevard. He had seen the sanctuary filled with light and streams of oil pouring from heaven upon Isaac Shakarian. It was an ordination, the only kind our church recognized, and so for nearly 10 years Dad had served as lay pastor of the church, receiving no salary, of course, in the Armenian tradition, obtaining a license from the state to marry and bury, preaching each Sunday, caring for the needs of the people. Then one Friday evening in the fall of 1964, Harry Mushigan had another dream. I was at the Coronado Hotel just south of San Diego that evening, November 6, at the start of a 3-day regional convention. Our daughter Jerry and her husband Gene Scalf were there too. They loved the fellowship, but with 2 small girls couldn't often be at the meetings. I knew how many arrangements they'd made so that both of them could attend this one, so I was surprised when Jerry came to me and said we must all go back at once to Downey. "It's grandfather," she said. He's in the hospital." "The hospital? But he's not sick. He was feeling fine when I left the office this afternoon. At the hospital reception desk, they told me Dad was in the building across the street. It was strange, I thought, as I stepped into the small one-story house, that they would put him where it was so dark and deserted. Where were the nurses? And then I realized that this little building was the morgue. Dad was lying on a tall white table. It was no wonder that no one had been able to tell me. Never had a father and son been so close. I stood there in the bare little room, hearing his voice, as I had hundreds of times over the years when an opportunity opened up somewhere in the world to tell men about Jesus. You go, Deimos. I'll take care of the business. At home, Dr. Donald Griggs was waiting for us. I had been right. Dad had not been sick. He died the way the old patriarchs died, Dr. Griggs said, in strength, not in sickness. He was reading the evening paper and he fell asleep. No one but Dr. Griggs and the immediate family knew, so we were surprised when Harry Mushigan telephoned from Atlanta, Georgia, where he now had a pastorate. The old men, he said. I've just seen them all. My grandfather, my father, all the old men I remember as a boy, and some I never saw. About an hour ago, I saw all these men with long white beards laughing and running and holding out their arms as though they were welcoming someone. And then I saw Isaac running toward them. There was a pause over the telephone. Isaac is gone, isn't he? The seatbelt sign was on for landing. The plane was banking, beginning its descent. You go, Deimos. That was what God said to each of us, wasn't it? You go, Jim, John, Bill, Mary. He didn't always tell us where. At the start of the journey, I thought of the second message the boy prophet received so long ago, still sealed and unopened. Does it foretell a great persecution coming to Christians in America just before the Lord returns? Personally, I think so. I think the Spirit is being given us in preparation for this time, to bind us into a body, to assign to each one of us the task he alone can do for the welfare of the body. I often wonder who will be told to open that message and read it to the church. But that's not the important thing. The important thing is that he tells each of us to go with whatever gift he is given, knowing that when we find that gift and use it, no matter what the condition of the world around us, we will be the happiest people on earth. The plane touched down with a little bump and taxied towards the terminal. Rose rummaged under the seat for our things. You ready, Deimos? She said. I'm ready, Rose. We stepped into the aisle and set out together toward the next adventure. That is the end of The Happiest People on Earth. Thank you for listening.